What's up guys, Rob here, and welcome to the Newb DM. Today I'm going to be going over the module I just posted on the Dungeon Masters Guild, Big Trouble with Little Goblins. So as I said, this is a module that I just posted on the Dungeon Masters Guild. I'll post a link to it down in the description, and it's a module that I wrote that can either be used as a one-shot game, or you can modify it to be incorporated into your normal campaign. Now this story I wrote and actually played with my group, and I will say the module that I wrote is a little bit different than how we played it. You see, when we played it, I had it very specific for our campaign. There are different points that I changed up in the module because it fit in better with my story. That being said, I wrote the module to be a little bit more vague and more easily modifiable. That way, if you want to incorporate it in your campaign, or if you feel that your players may like, say, different monsters, you can easily change them out to fit your needs. So, the reason I chose this module is because when I played it with my group, my players had varying degrees of experience. I had one player that had played for years. I had another player who was brand new. I had other players who had played a few sessions and knew the game, but weren't deep into it. With all that being said, at the end of the day, everyone had a great time and everyone loved it. So when we played it, I found that everyone was having a good time. There were points for role-playing and there's points for battles. And in the end of the day, a lot of people were able to use different means of creativity to solve different points throughout the dungeon. So the premise of this story is that the players find a stronghold that's inhabited by a group of goblins. But when they check out the goblins, they find that a majority of them are injured to the point where they're missing limbs and barely holding on to life. When they explore further into this, they find out that a horde of undead have appeared in the catacombs of the stronghold. And when they look further into it, it turns out that a necromancer has also taken base in this area. Now, with all that being said, I do want to point out that this isn't going to be a summary of the story. My goal for this video is to give tips and tricks on how you can optimize the story to fit your needs and points that I felt that really stood out when we played this campaign. The other reason I'm not going to go into an in-depth summary is because I have this set as pay what you want on the Dungeon Masters Guild, meaning you can go in there and get it for free. I have it set as pay what you want so that if you want to pass something to me as a thank you or telling me that you had a good time with this campaign, that's fine. But at the same time, I'm writing these so that you guys can experience the same amount of fun that I had, so I'm not going to be mad or offended if you decide not to pay anything. At the end of the day, Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games are about fun, and as long as you have fun with this module, that's really all that matters. So with all that being said, let's go on ahead and get started. So the story begins with the players finding a roadside inn that's ran by a halfling male named Hob. Now, while Hob is very, very friendly, his prices are very expensive, and the reason everything is so high in price is because he's had a very sharp decline in customers. Now, it turns out the reason that he's had the decline in customers is because there have been attacks on the road that the inn is located on. He tells the party that he believes that it's some goblins that are held up in a stronghold nearby, and he asks the party if they'll go and take care of the problem. And obviously, he offers a reward. Now, when I played it with my campaign, my players actually got the quest from a duke who was kind of worried about a trade route near his town where people have been getting attacked. So you can change out the scenario that gives the player the quest. I just put the idea of Hob and the roadside in there because it's very basic, it's very simple, it's an easy concept to start out with that really is just okay, well, here's a quest, now you can start it. Now, your players may decide not to go into the inn, and that's fine. They will eventually pass the stronghold if they continue on this road. At that point, if they don't go into the stronghold, you may have to find a more creative means to entice them to go into it. But at that point, if they're not willing to go into it, I'm sure that they're not going to be interested in the first place, so what are you going to do? Now, you can substitute the goblins for any other type of species that is typically weak individually but strong as a group. This will come into play later on, and it should ring a few bells, hopefully for your more experienced players. That being said, kobolds can probably be used as well. Really, as I said, anything that's just weak individually, but strong as a group, and typically a more cowardly group, will really fit into this place perfectly. So the first thing the players are going to see as they approach the stronghold are two goblins keeping guard around the entrance. These two goblins should stand out because, as I said, goblins tend to fight in groups, and just two goblins by themselves doesn't make much sense. To add on to this, if your players are hostile, I would suggest that when it's the goblins' turns, for them to, instead of attacking, to take every advantage that they can to flee from the party and run into the stronghold. Now this comes into play later on because them fleeing gives the sense that there are only two goblins out there, and that's because most of the goblins are terminally injured. So I want to point out that I have a very diverse party. I've got some players who just want to solve all their problems with violence, and I've got other party members who prefer to use magical tricks to their advantage to kind of roleplay their way out of problems and issues. So in this particular case, the more roleplay heavy group members won out, and they decided that they were going to go talk to the goblins instead of just outright attacking them. So they go up to the goblins, and they're going up to them in the most passive means necessary. Hands in the air, no sign of aggression, borderline waving a white flag in the air. And they go up to the goblins, and the goblins are obviously kind of cowering and backing away, and they pick up a stick, and they start drawing pictures in the dirt, trying to communicate the best they can with these goblins. I don't remember if I pointed this out, but none of my players spoke Goblin. And they spend a significant amount of time trying to communicate with these goblins through drawings and pictures. And finally, after a few minutes, I look at them, and as the goblin, I say, "What are you guys talking about?" None of my players knew that goblins spoke common as well. It was really funny, but it gave a really unique chance for roleplay and creativity. Even though my players weren't aware that they could speak to the goblins, they still went about the situation the best they could. There is one goblin keeping guard inside the main entrance. This is going to be a point where you as the DM are going to have to decide how you want to play it. If the two goblins happen to flee inside and they run past, there's a good chance that the third goblin is going to run as well. Or maybe you just want to leave that goblin there to fight or confront the party. It's really up to you. So continuing on through the upper portion of this stronghold, eventually the players will come to the room that is absolutely full of goblins. But these goblins are all injured, missing limbs, cuts, bruises. A lot of them are unconscious. Many of them, you're surprised, are still alive. And just as all good goblin tribes, they've got a hobgoblin leader. Now this hobgoblin's name is Tarvik, and the players see instantly that he is severely injured. He's actually missing one of his legs, and he hobbles up to him. Now, when he goes up to the players, he goes up to them in a very defensive stance. He's very cautious, and it's very important at this point to point out that there's no aggression from him toward the players. Not necessarily because he likes them or that he's scared, but it's just he knows that given his current state and the goblins around him current state, if the players decided to be aggressive or hostile, there's absolutely no way they could win. In fact, if your players do attack these goblins, pretty much all of them are going to have 1 hit point, and their AC would be, I'd say, below 5. So the players can talk to Tarbig, and from him they can find out that it was actually the undead horde that has somehow appeared in the catacombs below that were attacking the travelers on the road, and that the goblins were actually trying to stop them from coming up through the bottom, because it more or less meant that if they come up from the catacombs, they're going to have to pass right through the goblin tribe. This also gives the players one of those moments of the stereotypical, oh, I thought the bad guy was bad, but it turns out who I thought was bad is actually innocent, but the bad guy is actually somebody else. The players can talk to Tarvik for a while, but if you feel like either he's given all the information he can, or the players are just talking to him too much, you can go on ahead with the next part of the campaign. The next part involves a group of zombies breaking the kind of barricade that the goblins have built up in order to come into the room and attack the players and the goblins. Now this is the point where, as the DM, you're going to have to make the choice on how to handle this battle. You can have just the typical players versus undead battle, where the undead come in, attack the players, they fight, and that's about it. Or you can have the option of making it maybe a little bit more realistic. Now, I think of the undead as being mindless and brainless, and in this particular case, since they were summoned by a necromancer, more or less, they're just there to complete their goal. So when the undead appear, this unfortunately makes the battle much easier for the players. But what I think of when I see the undead is that they're not going to go and make the smart decision of going after who they think is the most dangerous, which would be the party. What the undead are going to do is actually go after the closest thing they can. In this particular case, it's going to be the goblins who are scattered on the floor. So this means a lot of the goblins will get killed off unless the party gets really close, in which case when they kill off a goblin, they may go after a party member instead. If you want to make this battle a little bit more difficult, but you still want to go along the whole gonna attack whatever's closest first, I would suggest at this point maybe adding on a few extra undead. So from here, the players find a set of stairs that lead underground behind the barricade that the undead broke through. Now, it's up to you at this point, but before the players go down, you can have Tarvig tell them about another barricaded door that's in the catacombs below. I had this as kind of like a bonus, kind of sub-boss fight for my players. Now, if you don't want to tell the players about this and just leave the mystery, that's totally fine. That's actually what I did for my players. I didn't mention that there was another barricaded door, and they found out the hard way that there was kind of a strong enemy behind it. What I would suggest telling the players, because it's going to make it easier for them as well as easier for you, is that the goblins were able to set some traps before they left the catacomb area and barricaded themselves into upper regions of this stronghold. The goblins set bear traps in a couple of areas throughout the catacombs below, and as the DM, you can use this to bring in more enemies without feeling like your players are getting overwhelmed. Now, once you're down here in the catacombs, the main thing I want to point out here is to make sure that you remember that even though the undead are still mindless beings, that doesn't necessarily mean that their senses are completely shot. They can still hear, and they can still see. The reason I bring this up is because when my party played this module, they decided to sneak down into the catacombs. Now, when they got down to the first room, there was a little bit of light, and the player had dark vision, so he could kind of see that there were some undead in this room, but he couldn't see too far behind that. In order to counteract this, what they did was the sorcerer cast a light on a bolt, and then they took the bolt and fired it from a crossbow across the room. Now, unfortunately, this bolt went across the room through the little door into the second room. So now a light source just shot through the air that alerted both the enemies from the first room and the second room. What that meant was that my players now had two different hordes of enemies to fight. In order to make my players not feel overwhelmed, I ended up setting some bear traps in between rooms 1 and 2. So that means whenever the enemies from room 2 try to enter into the battle in room 1, they had to make a dexterity check to see if they got caught by these bear traps. So if the enemy failed its dexterity check, it took some damage and it was caught in the bear trap. Now, while this made the battle a little bit easier, it did add a little bit more suspense to it, because now the players not only have the enemies in the room to fight, but that they can see there are more enemies that are held back at the moment, but there's a chance they can get free and come attack them. Now, later on, the players will find the barricaded door. Now, behind this door is a very strong enemy. It's a skeletal minotaur on top of a skeletal warhorse. I placed this room there because a lot of my players were new, with little to no experience, and I wanted to give them the sense of accomplishment. So this serves two purposes. One, it means that the players are going to have to make the choice if they want to remove the barricade and find out what's behind it. Second, it means that if your players do decide to move the barricade, and they are capable of defeating the enemy behind it, then they will be rewarded. That being said, these are goblins, so don't expect them to have great treasure, so even though your players do defeat it, I wouldn't go give them piles and piles of gold. Now, the next area I want to focus on is going to be a hallway that connects the second room to a little antechamber area. Now, the reason I want to point this out is because it's kind of a unique trap in that it's a hallway that's fully lined with bear traps. Now, I actually had a few unique points with my players when they were handling this trap. So first of all, one of my players is a druid, and he can transform into a giant spider. And he used the giant spider's ability to crawl across the ceiling, walking over and past the bear traps in this hallway to the antechamber. And back here, he saw a few skeletons. The players actually decided to use this to their advantage, and they kind of coaxed the skeletons into the hallway, so it more or less made them hit a bunch of the bear traps, though it didn't take care of all of them. So once the skeletons were wiped out, what they did then was there was some bedding in the barricade that was blocking the Minotaur and Warhorse. So what they did was they took this bedding and they used it as a means to cover the bear traps. Now, I still made them roll their dexterity checks for these because technically they are stepping on them, but I did give them a little bit of an advantage because the bedding would have, at least in my opinion, would have softened the blow. Now, I know in real life, even if you put, a bunch of hay or something over a bear trap, if that thing closes on your leg, it's probably going to break your leg. But in the D&D world, it's a fantastical world that's, has some crazy events to happen, and I'm not going to push that too much. Anyway, this is a really unique area that you can use your players' creativity to find their way to get past all of these bear traps with taking, hopefully, little to no damage. So I should probably point out, there is a secret door that leads into the burial chamber inside of the little Minotaur Skeletal Warhorse room. My players didn't find it. So the last room of this little catacomb area is the burial chamber. Inside this area, the players will find a necromancer, as well as a few other undead. That battle should be pretty straightforward, so you can figure out how you want to handle it. The only thing you'll need to consider is if the necromancer dies, does it affect the undead in the area? By that I mean, let's say your party decides to skip the barricaded room. Does the skeletal Minotaur and skeletal Warhorse die, or do they survive on even after the necromancer's dead? This is another point where my story is a little bit different than what's in the module. In my story, I actually use a monster that I filmed on the D&D Reddit that a gentleman had made that was more or less Jason Voorhees. I found it was pretty interesting, and it was a pretty fun fight, and I was able to tweak it just a little bit so it actually fit into the campaign, and they had a few things pop up that led them to their next destinations. So that's another point where it differs from what's written on here, but the story itself, as I said before, is very modifiable. If you decide that you don't want the party to fight a necromancer, you want them to fight a bigger horde, or you want them to fight a different enemy entirely, that's up to you. The way I set up this module, there shouldn't be any problems changing that last enemy, so if you want to use a necromancer, or if you want to use the beefed up undead, that's entirely up to you. And that's pretty much everything I've got for this module. I hope this video has been helpful. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the video and the module. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and as always, have fun. Hey Jack, do you want to be part of my video? Nope.